Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to talk about subwoofers again. It's a very comprehensive series I'm trying to do because this REL 25 just confirmed what I've always believed, that properly integrated sub in your room is really what's necessary to take things to that upper echelon performance. There's just nothing that most floor standers, even of high budget, can do physically, physics-wise, the same that this can do. Displacing this much air and the things that it can do, and the advantages of alleviating your amps and your main speakers from doing a lot of those tasks is a huge benefit as well, and can improve across the spectrum everything you hear. But that actually brings up a point that I'm going to go over today. Try to cover a few things: the interface of your sub to the rest of the system, like I just spoke about. Number two, placing your sub, where to place it in your room, how to do that properly. Number three, the crossover point between your mains and the sub, and phase. Let's see if I can get through all those things today really quickly, but comprehensively enough to help you guys avoid the mistakes I've made over the years. So let's talk about placement first. I have mine in the corner. I have mine basically wherever I can fit it, okay? That's the reality. And so everything in life is trade-offs. Just like my last video with room treatments, you may not be able to have a dedicated room with all the room treatments I have, but you have the ability to move your sub around. So you may not be able to do what I did in the last video. You can move your sub. That's great. I can't move the sub, so I have all these treatments. If you can move your sub, it's good to start in the corner like REL recommends with this specific one, and aim it at the longest distance in the room. There's some advantages, but that's not really that important. It's more important to measure at your listening position, because no matter how great your sub is, if you've got a listening position where right at the point of a cancellation, you're going to miss the frequency. When you see these dips of 10, 20 dB and then peaks, it's not the driver doing that. That's just cancellations and peaks in your room causing that issue. So being able to move the sub around, measure, and see if you can negate some of these cancellations that are inevitable in almost every room, unless you can do all the bass traps that I've done. And also realize you can move your listening position if possible. And those two combined are going to be a little bit of time investment, but that's what you're going to need to do with different frequencies along the bass spectrum, at least up to 120, 150 hertz. Just go ahead all the way up to 200 hertz, really. Just see if you have any peaks and valleys, and place the sub in different spots with those test tones to see which place is the best for negating a huge drop off or peak at your listening position. Now, once you've got that done, well, probably even before you got that done, you got to interface the sub to your system. And I talked about one of the advantages being you can alleviate with a sub like this, and 1,000-watt amp, 15-inch driver. That's great. I can now do a lot of sub frequencies and take that load off of my main speakers with the crossover of only sending those lower frequencies to the sub. But REL has another option for hooking up your sub if you want to. It's a high level connection where it comes right off your amp, such that your main speakers and the sub play the same frequencies. And they have some talk about why that's advantageous. I, in practice, don't use that. I've tried it, don't really like it. The reason being, especially with a sub like this sub playing 40 hertz is a lot different in speed-wise and power than my main speakers playing 40 hertz. So I don't want those two playing the same frequencies at all. And again, I don't even gain the benefit of alleviating that demand on my amps and these speakers for other frequencies that 10-inch driver in here can do. So if it works for you, it's great that REL offers that option. I'm just saying, don't dogmatically think that that's the best way just because it worked for somebody or REL says it does. I would say probably on average, if I went into 10, 20 people's rooms, more people would do the LFE than the high level input. But it's there for you to try both, and that's great that REL gives you that option. Most subs don't give you that option. So interfacing it, pretty straightforward, but while we're talking about interface, let's go off to a little bit of a tangent. When you do the interface, you're likely going to hear a hum when you, at least when you first start interjecting subs into your system. The reason being is your sub sometimes is in the corner in a different area of your rest of your gear, and it requires a plug because it's got its own amp. And guess what that plug goes into? A different outlet than the rest of your system. So then you have the potential for ground loops. And then a lot of people with subs also are hooked up to a home theater, which also entails having a cable box hooked up. And that's probably the second biggest, if not the first biggest cause of ground loops. That cable line, you need to get one of these little isolation devices that fit in line on the cable box, on the cable line, and that'll cure that problem. So those are the two problematic areas: plugging in the sub at a different outlet will sometimes cause ground loops, and your cable line. If you address those two 90% of the time, you'll be good. I even had it with this sub, which kind of confused me and disappointed me at first, because I had a Vandersteen there, really good sub, but the same power outlet I use and same RCA 0.1 LFE input, but this one had the hum and the Vandersteen didn't. But here's how I troubleshoot it. First of all, the hum was higher with volume, so that told me the problematic device was further up the food chain before it got to at least the volume control on the REL. So, but then again, I was like, everything up until the REL didn't have a hum with the Vandersteen, so why? So I looked at the inputs, and sure enough, changing XLR input versus the RCA 0.1 input improved things. It didn't get rid of it totally, but that told me that some of the hum was probably some radiated issue, or the input on the back of this is attached to a parametric EQ, so maybe not all inputs are equal on the back of this REL. Who knows? I would just assume, I love this REL more than anything, but I'm not a total fanboy. I would do a couple things. I'd take that parametric EQ out of here. It doesn't really need it, and it really doesn't do much anyway, even if you were going to use it. So it probably only causes more problems than it solves. I wouldn't want anything in there next to that huge magnet of that big driver anyway. But that being said, that's just nitpicking, but that's my 2 cents. In any case, getting rid of that hum, cable line, outlet power, those were the issues. I noticed it was going up with volume, so I knew it was somewhere. And then I had one of those. I just didn't need it with the Vandersteen sub. I needed it with this one to get rid of the cable line causing a ground loop. So solving that problem, anecdotal story for me, probably applies to you. Hopefully it'll help you. Next, crossover point. That is going to be dependent on your main speakers. If you have, and then even looking at the specs, don't even, like a Maggie can go down to technically 40 hertz, but you don't want it playing 40, 50, even 60 hertz. I would roll that Maggie off pretty high. But other ones, if you have Magicos that go pretty low, or whatever main speakers that have really good bass performance, you might want to roll it off at the crossover point much lower. The key is you don't want to locate the sub, and you don't want the sub playing locatable frequencies. This one, to its credit, and is only 90, max crossover you could set is 90 hertz, which means it's probably not going to be playing very loud anything that's a locatable frequency. And I've gotten it to disappear in this room, which I thought was not going to be all that easy to do. But that's part of the reason. It doesn't, we're not playing much higher, and it doesn't even allow you to tempt it to play much higher, where higher frequencies do become locatable. Lower frequencies are not locatable. So in theory, a sub, you say you shouldn't be able to locate it if it's just playing low frequencies. But if you cross it over high enough, turn off your main speakers, you'll know 12 dB, 24 dB slope, depending on which one it chooses, it can go fairly high before it goes silent. So it can get up to 200-300 hertz. You'll still hear something coming out of here. And that's when you're in frequencies that you can locate, which makes the setup and performance not that great. You want to just hear the effects of the sub without knowing where the sub is. So crossover point is very important, and there's no dogmatic 1 point. THX specifies 80 hertz, and that's a good place to start. But really, it's so across the board with your taste and your main speakers and a variety of factors that you just have to listen for yourself. Once you can get the speaker to disappear and still get the performance flat with some measurements, then you got your crossover point set. But one other aspect that I talked about is phase. Even when you've got your crossover set, you may find that at the crossover point you have a dip or a peak. So here's the deal with phase. Most instructions tell you about phase. They say, oh, just have somebody switch the phase button on the sub while you're sitting down and listen to which one's louder. That sounds great. In theory, it should work, but in reality, with most subs and most rooms, people are very hard to tell it just by ear. And even if you break out an SPL meter, sometimes it's not a big difference if they're out of phase. There's just so much else happening that can make that a little bit tougher to determine, mainly because the test tones are usually these low frequency pink noise. And so what I recommend doing is going a little bit more detailed into determining phase. Whatever you choose as your crossover point, that's the point at which, in theory, your main speakers and the sub are overlapping kind of the most. So that's where you want to get a test tone just for that frequency range, that little window, and see if when you're playing the full speed, play 20 hertz, 30 hertz, let's say it's 80 hertz where your crossover, play 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. If you hear when it gets to 80, that crossover point or around there, that all of a sudden bass goes down, then you know that they're out of phase and they're canceling. If it's even or even maybe a little bit of a peak, then they're in phase. And in my case, setting up the REL 25, I had to 180 phase it. This one basically just has 0 or 180. The SVS has increments of 15-degree phase, which can get really complicated. Really, 180 or 0 is really most people's problems. It's either in phase or out of phase. So, and do it if you got two subwoofers, then that makes it a little more difficult because you got to make sure the subwoofers are in phase as well as your mains are in phase. So what I would do is turn off your second sub, make sure your main one sub is in phase with your mains at that crossover point. Boom. If you know it's 180, good. Then do the other one. And then if your benchmark is basically your main speakers, if both are now in phase with your main speakers individually, then they're going to be in phase with each other as well. But you want to double check and play it just to make sure there's no issues. And that's why you might have variations over the 180 phase degrees. And so that's what the SVS offers, but it's a very rare situation. So I think I covered everything. Hopefully this is under 20 minutes. That was my goal. The next video, I'm going to do test tones. So I'll show you test tones that I use to test. Now, really, there's limitless test tones because when you have a great sub like this, literally it improves everything. Every little minute thing is enhanced. But I wanted to create a playlist that you could use to test that includes a variety of types of bass because rap bass is different from an orchestra bass, and then they have exotic bass like Mickey Hart Planet Drums. He uses a variety of percussive instruments. You're going to want to test all of these different types. And studio versus live, there's so many pipe organs versus other types of bass, percussive instruments. So I tried to put together a playlist that you could use and benchmark your performance. And then when you get new subs or, maybe audition a new one, this would be a great playlist to see, is it really improving across the board, or are you getting a sub that maybe just excels in one area and not the other? So stay tuned for that. And then the next video after that, I'm going to address the issue that comes up very commonly when you have a sub that can displace this much air. You're going to have resonances, and that's a problem. When you hear rattling, that's not high fidelity. So I'm going to have a little bit of, in fact, I had to buy about 3 more of these things thanks to this sub, because even things in my hallway are rattling now. So I'll have a video on how to address the resonances. So hopefully you enjoyed. Sign up, subscribe, and then we'll be back soon.